Hi, everyone. Happy Friday. Welcome to our panel discussion on podcasting LGBTQ history, part 2, hosted by the LGBT Historical Society. My name is Nalini Elias. I'm the Director of Exhibitions and Museum Experience at the Society, and I'm here to introduce today's event and moderator. But first, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that the LGBT Historical Society is based on Ohlone tribal land. I invite any Indigenous folks with us today to make themselves visible in the chat and be recognized as we honor the contemporary and ancestral lives of America's Indigenous people. So please take a moment to do that anytime. And also I want to thank Lee Pfeffer, our Manager of Museum Experience, for putting this wonderful event together. All right, so today's event is being recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube channel and our website. So if you're watching live with us, we welcome your active participation in the forum, and we encourage you to post comments and discussions in the chat and ask questions for the moderator and panelists for our Q&A segment. So a bit about us. The Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender, GLBT Historical Society was founded in 1985, and it is recognized internationally as a leader in the field of LGBTQ public history. Our mission is to collect, preserve, exhibit, and make accessible to the public materials and knowledge to support and promote understanding of LGBTQ history, culture, and all arts in their diversity. Our operations are centered around two sites: the GLBT Historical Society Museum, located in the Castro District since 2011, and the Dr. John P. DeCecco Archives and Research Center in the Mid-Market District. And although our physical locations are, the archives is currently closed due to the pandemic, our museum is open on a limited basis. So please check out the website for more information on that. And you can continue to check out our website for online exhibitions, events, and archival resources at glbthistory.org. And finally, I want to thank all of our members and donors who make our work possible. If you're not already a card-carrying member of the GLBT Historical Society, please consider joining today. Members get a variety of perks, including a 20% discount on purchases of cool flags from our online store. Now on to today's event, Podcasting LGBTQ History Part 2. Our moderator will be Rick Oculto. Their pronouns are he, him. And he is the education director at Our Family Coalition, a nonprofit organization dedicated to serving LGBTQ families with children. In his role, he has provided professional and personal development workshops for thousands of education professionals and families nationwide. A nonprofit professional with over 15 years of experience, Rick started the first transgender youth group in the Bay Area, was a lead organizer in the Fair Education Act Implementation Coalition, and has provided consultation for foreign ambassadors wanting to learn promising practices for improving the lives of LGBTQ people in their home countries. Thank you, Rick, for all you do. And with that, I will turn it over to Rick to introduce the panelists and to lead the discussion. And then I'll hop off and watch the live stream on Facebook. Thank you.
Thank you, Lili. Hello, everyone. I have this inclination to say good morning, but I know that we're watching all across the world. And so just hello, and thank you for joining us today. I know that there are a lot of emotions in the air, and those emotions are really fueled by the fact that the conversation that we are going to have today is really essential to how we navigate all the different things that are happening in the world. And so I want to thank you for joining us in this conversation. I'm really, really excited by the panel that we have. Just to let you know, and again, Nalini, thank you for the great introduction. My role today is the moderator. And for those of you that don't know my history, I was not a great fan of history growing up. There were not many representations for me as far as queer people or people of color. And I thought, I guess it's interesting, but it doesn't have anything to do with me. And so in many ways, ironically, I'll be your straight man as far as the person who doesn't know a lot of this stuff, but is really, really excited to be a part of it and learn more about how LGBTQ folks, people who are gender and sexual minorities, have been part of history and essential to that. So first up, we're going to do some introductions. I'm going to have them each introduce themselves. We're going to start with Sally Chum from None on the Record. And so, Sally.
Was me. Hoping you guys can hear me. Okay. Yes. Yes. Yep. Okay. Great.
There you go.
My name is Sally Chum, and I am the executive director of None on Record, which is an African LGBT and digital media organization based in Nairobi, Kenya. And I'm also the executive producer of the Afroqueer podcast, which is also produced and published in Nairobi, Kenya. And we document stories from African LGBT experiences. And Afroqueer is a documentary style podcast that we are now going into our 4th season, starting in March.
All right. Well, thank you, Sally. Next up, I'd like to welcome Morgan M. Page from One from the Vaults.
Hi, I am Morgan M. Page, pronounced she, her. I am the creator and host of One from the Vaults, the one and I don't think actually only anymore trans history podcast, where I bring you all of the dirt, gossip, and glamour from trans history. I'm also the co-writer of a number of film projects related to trans history, including Framing Agnes, which should be out hopefully sometime next year. Yeah, that's me.
Thank you, Morgan. And then next up, our glorious host, and also the host of History is Gay, Lee Pfeffer.
Hi, how are you doing? I'm also trying to figure out this new system, so apologies if we have weird layouts. Hi, everyone. I'm Lee Pfeffer, they, them. I am the co-host and producer of History is Gay podcast, which our tagline is, because history has never been as straight as you think. We look at queer history where it's existed all throughout the world and time, because queerness is not a Western or white ideal that people have thought about, you know, trying to push that narrative. And we go from a whole bunch of different ends of the spectrum, and we take it from a humorous point of view, much like Morgan was saying about her podcast. We kind of are a little bit cheeky about it, and we end every episode with a how gay were they rating, and we have fun with it. It's a nice intersection between history nerds and fandom nerds. So that's what we do.
All right. Well, thank you, Lee. And next up, how about Huw Lemmey from Bad Gays?
Hi there, my name's Huw Lemmey. I'm a writer and novelist, and I live in Barcelona, but as you can tell from my accent, I'm neither Spanish nor Catalan, I'm British. And alongside Ben Miller, who's also on screen now, we're the co-hosts of Bad Gays, which, as it says on the screen, is a podcast all about evil and complicated queers in history. So we take a look at the darker side, maybe, or the people you might not want to claim as gay heroes, and ask what their life stories can tell us about what it means to be gay, what it means to be queer, and other interesting questions about history, class, and how we talk about how we came to our current sort of LGBTQ identities.
Great. Thanks, Huw. Ben?
Sure. Hi, my name is Ben Miller. I use he, him pronouns. I live in, and I'm calling in from Berlin, Germany, but I am, as you can probably hear, not German. I am originally from Boston, Massachusetts. I am in addition to being a co-host of Bad Gays with Huw, and Huw did a great job introducing the show, and I don't think I really need to say any more at this point. I am also a member of the board of the Schwules Museum in Berlin, which, along with the LGBT Historical Society, is one of the world's leading independent archives and museums devoted to archiving, researching, and preserving and presenting queer visual cultures and histories. And I am also, and this is much less fancy than it sounds, I promise, a doctoral fellow in global intellectual history at the Friedrich Meinecke Institute of the Free University of Berlin, writing a PhD project about resonances in thinking about queerness and primitivism and time in Weimar era Germany and 1970s California.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ben. All right, and this is our illustrious panel for today. Very excited to have you all here. And so we're just going to get into it. We've only got a little bit of time, and I'd love to get deep into some of these topics with you. And so, first of all, we have a lot of different podcasts here. You all represent a lot of different parts of queer history. And some of the things that you tackle are more obscure, and in some cases, such as with Bad Gays, less palatable parts of queer history. And so, for a topic that is already not very well known, how and why did you get into your particular brand of telling history?
Ooh, who wants to go first?
I'm going to go first.
All right.
Yeah, me and Ben sort of knew each other online, and I've been doing some research about the relationship in British culture and history between homosexuality and espionage. And in the process, it was throwing up all these really amazing figures and characters, who were either self-identified as gay or queer, or they lived queer lives, but they were involved in these amazing world-changing moments in British and world history in the 20th century, and the things that their sexuality really intersected really deeply with the historical events, because for example, there was blackmail or secret affairs between spies and things like this, and I was like, these are really fascinating stories, but these are not the stories of gay heroes. Like the books and podcasts you read, I was reading that were sort of popular about gay history were very much about painting with a broad brushstroke, Oscar Wilde, for example, or Harvey Milk, come from a gay perspective. And I was like, well, I want to know more about people like Anthony Blunt, for example, or Guy Burgess. And so me and Ben were talking, we did a bit of digging, and decided, okay, this is actually a great subject for a podcast. It's because in each of these individual stories, these individual lives, you have a microcosm of developing gay identities, queer identities, and these stories aren't told because they're not about reclaiming a positive gay history. So yeah, that's where we were coming from. We wanted to produce like a more, perhaps a more nuanced or like a different angle into looking at the development of LGBTQ history.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think it serves a really important purpose of showing, right, that we as queer people, us of queer experience, aren't of one stripe. That we come from lots of different walks of life, lots of different beliefs, and that you can't villainize or make us heroes in different lights just because of our queer identity or background, right? Really, really important.
The point of our show, if I can just jump in quickly, and then we can move off of our show and onto the other shows. The point of our show is not to, like, and I use this word judiciously because it's overused, but the point of our show is not to cancel anybody. Maybe Mayor Pete a little bit, but like maybe Andrew Sullivan. But mostly the point of our show is not to cancel anybody. Mostly we're coming in with a very critical, but also with an eye that is always kind of looking for complexity and looking for nuance in the ways that these stories get told, and maybe looking to make claims for representation that we think are really real and really important, deepen them a little bit somehow, and potentially make them more interesting. I mean, the concept for the show, the idea of kind of profiling evil gays, that all came from Huw. And as soon as I heard about it, the reason I knew I was on board was not only because I like when people who aren't historians are doing this kind of work, because I think it's really important that we do this work with people, those of us who are inside the academy or not, or those of us who find ourselves inside the academy at any given moment. But also because I think that there is, and it was sort of a proof of concept, the audience that we found for the show, that there is an audience out there at this point that is ready for queer content that is not at a 101 level. Like, we do not need to just only tell the most basic kinds of stories, and yet that is what media gatekeepers want, much of the time. They want the simplest and most kind of palatable possible thing, and you should sort of feel lucky to have that, because maybe then you'll have nothing at all. And so we thought that there was room to make something different, and that's what we tried to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I am curious, Morgan, Sally, Lee, do these resonate with you? Are they the reasons that you also, engage in your brand of history telling? Okay, seeing some nods.
I'm happy to go. Yeah, I mean, this resonates with my experience a lot. Although I will say the actual secret reason I started my podcast is part of a complex revenge plot against an ex-boyfriend who did me wrong. The best revenge you can have in the world is creating something very successful that fills up all of your ex's feeds. But anyway, for me, really how I did get into history was around a lot of work I was doing with trans young people and trans sex workers. And a lot of young people I was encountering, this is sort of pre-transgender tipping point, like pre-2014, but a lot of the really young people I was encountering truly did not know that there were even trans youth before the year 2000. They thought it was brand new. They were the first ones. And on the one hand, it was like, oh, exciting. I get to be the only one. But on the other hand, I had to give them kind of a reality check and be like, I mean, there have been decades and decades of trans young people, babe, if not centuries and millennia. But when you did when I did connect young people to stories from before, you could just see their eyes light up. Like, I think it becomes easier when we're connected to a history to be able to actually imagine a future for ourselves. And I think that's one of the really pernicious problems with the way that queer and trans people and also people who have been colonized are treated by the dominant culture, which is really to cut us off from our history as much as possible and make us seem anomalous and like a small recent problem that can be solved or obliterated by the mainstream culture. But once you're connected to that history and you know that, like, oh, in, ancient Assyrian culture, there were trans women priestesses to the goddess Inanna, then you really can't make the argument that trans people don't deserve rights today. So that's a bit for me.
Yeah, absolutely important to see us represented there. Excuse me, got something stuck in my throat. In any case, I'm curious as well, Sally. How does this resonate with you? How did your brand of history telling come into play?
So I have been oral histories of LGBT Africa for 15 years now. And when I started as an audio documentarian. My first career was actually working for public radio here in the United States. I was traveling throughout North America at the time, and so that means the US and Canada at the time, documenting the stories for Africa. So that came about because of the murder of a activist named Fanny Ann Eddy, who was a very powerful activist in Sierra Leone. He was murdered in town after coming back from the United Nations in Geneva to give a statement about, the experiences of queer Africans in her home country. So at that time, being a West African myself, I'm Senegalese and American. I had never heard of any of this LGBT activism happening in West Africa, and this was 2004, 2005. And I had never heard of any activism happening there. It was primarily documented, talked about within South Africa at the time. And so when she was murdered, the story of the murder and now subsequently her activism is now in the international press. And I think for me at that time, it had an impact on me because I am West African and I did not know this was going on in my region. That, you know, the only reason we were talking about this work now was because this woman had been killed. And so I began to travel to document these stories. And I think over the last 15 years, and then moving into the podcast space, it just was a natural progression of the work, telling these stories. And because it was so difficult at the time to even, you know, really find a lot of queer history on the continent, you know, that spanned the continent at the time, it was really about making a contemporary archive at the time. Now, in the last couple of years, we've been able to work, and also it's just it's an indication of how people have been able to now actually study queer African history more on the continent. It was very difficult to do so at the time. So a lot of even the documentations of queer African identities were being done by, you know, or Europe. And so now we're starting to see more, for lack of a better phrase, like homegrown research, you know, the stories of queer Africans before colonization, which is a period that is very, you know, it's not, the documentation wasn't a lot of ways. So that's how things started. In terms of just text, in terms of the podcast, that was just I think one of the team members walked into the office, like, I think we should like make a podcast. So we just took a lot of this music and then decided to put it into a podcast platform, like, you know, distribute through. So I think often thinking in terms of accessibility, because we also produce a lot of film content as well. And people weren't able to see it. It was getting banned or people had the access to it on YouTube, etc. And so we decided to work in the audio medium because we really felt that it would be more accessible as well, content. And so that's how I was born.
Yeah, and has been shared by a few times now, the way that you have delivered these stories, the way that you really examine some of these different ways that gender and sexuality have been looked at throughout the continent is really not unique, but refreshing because of the way that it has not been done like this before. So, yeah. It also occurs to me that, you know, one of the things that you said is that this started from, and I feel like this is part of the queer story as well, that this started from a tragedy. You saw something happen and you're like, we've got to respond, right? So I am curious now as well, since we're on this topic of this difficulty and starting from tragedy, you know, in the last panel discussion that we had, of course, none of you were part of the panel at the time, but we talked about the reach of all the different podcasts and what it might mean for folks in different places. With Eric Marcus, we touched on the fact that his show gets distributed in places that are not welcoming or even safe for queer people. Russia was one of the examples given. And being that we have such a global representation here, what's your experience with this? Have you faced challenges or even surprising positive impacts? And what were they?
I think, Ben, you're muted.
I was muted. I was saying I'm always shocked, and I realized I was muted. I'm always shocked by who finds themselves to us and how. You know, it's all. I don't know if the rest of you enjoy procrastinating by digging into your stats maps, but I'm always like wondering to myself, like, who is our Uzbekistani listener? Because we do have one or two. Like, who? Like, no, seriously, who are these people? Like, I even though I don't want to like surveil our listeners, I'm always just so curious as to how they're finding their way to us. I'll say, at least for me, and maybe Huw, this is your experience as well. The most gratifying thing that's happened since we started doing the show is the letters that we get or the notes that we get from we get notes from like 17-year-old non-binary communists who live in Ottumwa, Iowa, or who like, and I'm like, you are amazing. You are wonderful. Like, please tell, like, the fact that I am making something that is like interesting or useful to you is, I'm just infinitely humbled by it, and that's it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a lot of really interesting questions about how you can even talk about, you know, the places in the world where the way that a lot of sort of official gay narratives talk about, you know, the places in the world where such and such a thing isn't welcome, or where such and such a thing is illegal, or such and such a thing is, etc. And I you know, there are just so many ways to talk about that are really bad, and that replicate and actually help construct a situation in which increasing numbers of gay men and lesbian women are not only voting for the center, but for the far right. But I will get off my soapbox.
Yeah, I think, Ben, you hit on something that, you know, when we started our show, it was very much like, oh, we're going to make this for ourselves and also our friends. Maybe some people will listen. Yeah. And then, you know, I don't know, there's something really powerful about getting an email from like a, you know, 19-year-old in Czechoslovakia who has emailed saying that they have a really homophobic coworker, but since they listened to our first episode on, you know, queer pirates, they were able to gain the courage to tell their homophobic coworker off in a very, you know, homophobic country. Like, I think those things consistently get to me. And also just, you know, hearing from listeners who, like what you were saying, you know, in the intro, Rick, who this is their first kind of exposure to, oh, I've existed before. I've existed all over the world, you know, and hearing from folks that are happy that we, you know, don't just stay in a, you know, Western white lane too. And it's always a, you know, I want to bring in voices who can tell their own stories as well. But like, I want to make sure that what we're talking about isn't just one thing. And, you know, we've gotten letters from people in Iran being like, thank you for talking about like medieval Arab lesbians. And it's like, I'm just really interested in all of this. Please, everyone, do more. Yeah, I think like seeing the stats and seeing, you know, that I think podcasts of anything have a really interesting global reach.
Yeah. And I think, you know, I think geography plays a lot with it too. I do, for those that are not aware, I mean, I guess it was put in the intro, I have helped with some international folks on some LGBTQ issues. And when I worked with a delegation of educators from Northern Ireland, you know, they're talking about how do we do representation of queer folks and show the queer community that we're welcoming in our spaces. And they flat out said, we can't put up flags because of how we interpret flags in our country and what that means to put down a flag somewhere. And so how do we do that? Similarly, with a religious delegation from Uganda that I worked with, who wanted to talk more about LGBTQ issues in their area, we were told by the State Department, who had brought them to us for that we could not communicate with them with anything that identified as LGBTQ or as sexual or gender minorities, because they are in danger of being murdered for having communication with folks like us, right? And so has that played out in any of your ways that you've, I guess, shaped your podcast or thought about how you're presenting these, or, you know, have you been locked out of different places where you might be distributing?
Trying to think.
No.
Not
One thing,
really. I
One thing I would say is one difference for my podcast over the years that I've been doing it is that I used to be based in Canada, and now I'm based in the UK. And for those who aren't in the know, the UK has become very rapidly one of the most anti-trans countries in the world. Like, it's been a very steep and very quick descent. And this has had a really profound effect on how I move through the world as someone whose whole life is based around doing sort of trans advocacy and history work. So, for example, when I do live editions of my podcast here in the UK or other speaking gigs related to the podcast, we have to go through security concerns now with the organizers in advance, including occasionally having security hidden in the audience because of the anti-trans protesters who will show up, who can be quite scary and threatening at times. And this is very jarring for me coming from Canada, where I'm used to doing like trans sex worker advocacy on TV and like running around and saying whatever I want and getting into all kinds of trouble talking about public sex and, you know, legal issues that nobody wants to touch. Like, I used to do a lot of work on HIV criminalization in Canada. That was kind of my thing. But in the UK, I have to be very conservative and very careful about where I go and what I do and what I say in public. So that's been, and I think that's probably something that people outside the UK don't think is happening. But in fact, almost every trans organizer, speaker, and performer that I know has these problems. So it's really, it's been quite a jarring difference. And I don't know if others can kind of relate to that where you all are.
Yeah, one thing I found really interesting is the way that the same shows can be interpreted in the feedback you get from listeners in different ways. Like, I find the negative reviews that we occasionally get actually really, really enlightening about the politics of different countries and how they approach what we're talking about. Because obviously we have our own politics and our own like understanding of LGBT solidarity and stuff that we talk about, and the same thing can be totally interpreted in a totally different way in various, you know, in different countries. So, for example, we did a special episode with Juliet Jakes, who is a trans writer from the UK, about Colonel Victor Barker, who was a trans, well, a trans man in early 20th century England and late Victorian time. And we got a few negative comments about us being part of a sort of trans activist, you know, overly politically correct for referring to Colonel Victor Barker as a signed female at birth. And likewise, from the US, we've had criticism because, so for example, we have a sort of, we address a lot of things to do with like the social construction of homosexuality. And so one of the things we repeat quite often when we're talking about what does it mean to be gay or queer throughout history is that that homosexuality is a Victorian invention, as is heterosexuality, and we've got some like really negative reviews from the American side of things because it was interpreted as being like a right-wing position that to make that argument and to say that like homosexuals haven't always existed. Like, of course, there's always been same-sex relations of various types. That's part of, I mean, that is what the show is all about and how we talk about that. But just to say that hits upon like a sort of culture war point in America around I guess whether it's something that's innate and whether it's always existed, that is much less controversial in the UK. I don't think you very rarely, once you've explained at least that point, hit upon that in America. But we were called like kind of almost like alt-right. Yeah,
someone called us alt-right. I think for was it the Mayor Pete episode?
No, it wasn't. It was just generally. It was like for specifically repeatedly making that point about. It
was something else. Yeah.
Contingent historical facts.
Negative reviews are always fun.
So fascinating for me. So for me, that's quite interesting. Is the way that something that you produce within one context, as it's interpreted in different contexts, you get a real eye on the hot button, hot topic sort of issues around LGBTQ politics in various different countries. That is really eye opening.
Yeah.
Right. And especially at a time where we're so sensitive to particular words and the way that they're used, sometimes we just forget some of the context in which those words are being spoken, right? And it gets really difficult to have a conversation. I do want to recognize, Sally, I know there's some like audio difficulties, and I see you put in you've marked to me that you do have some experiences in this. Can you speak to that?
I'm also just hoping you all can hear me really well. Can you? Because I'm hearing, just to be clear, I'm hearing like literally every third word. I'm sort of following and shaking my head whenever I do. Definitely,
it's shaky at times, so we can get the gist of it.
Okay. But in terms of the audience question, yes, we have a very engaged audience, and I think we get a lot of WhatsApp messages because we distribute on WhatsApp. It's like our distribution plan. I mean, as podcasters, it's really important to track who's listening to your podcast, the retention rate, all those kinds of things. We've also found that, and we can't track that actually through WhatsApp, but we've also found that we've been able to reach people easier, faster, they're able to get and listen as well. So we get a lot of messages through there, and also our Instagram, of course. So I think for most people, it's a podcast that makes people feel a lot less alone. I think, particularly during COVID, you got a lot of messages about how the podcast was helping them to feel such a more connected community. A large part of our listenership is based on the continent, but a large part of our listenership is also the diaspora, particularly I believe the numbers in there, like the US and the UK. So we do also speak a lot to Africans that are in the diaspora, which are plentiful. And I was very specific on the show that our stories would have to run the gamut of taking place actually on the continent, but also to look into African communities and the diaspora and what they are still facing, which is a very different experience in some regards. So we have a huge audience actually, and I think also have a lot of LGBT people who are not from the continent too, which is really fantastic. And then I think we have a lot of people who don't identify as LGBT or queer, they're not foreign, but they do like podcasts and they like our podcast, and so they listen. So that's fantastic. But in terms of the question around the challenges for distribution, yes, we've had to, I think because most of us working on the show are trained journalists. It's really difficult because we do exist in some regards in a space that is libertarian. So, in some ways, we have to be very mindful of how we frame stories, or even sometimes being very careful in terms of the kind of stories we're going to tell. We actually just had to pull a story this season, which was really heartbreaking because they worked on it for quite a long time. And strangely, and ironically, it was about censorship. So we ended up having to pull it because it directly challenged an African government's censorship. Wow. Being able to publish it, which is fair enough.
Yeah, well, I mean, it makes sense. It's awful.
Awful, yeah.
I wondered, as you were talking about distribution and the importance of reaching out to all these different communities, I know for a fact, for example, that at the beginning of the Bad Gays podcast, you talk about what it means to engage in queer history. And so taking into account the ways queer people and ideas have had to been obfuscated through the lens of history, how do you define queer history as it applies to your show? What counts as queer? I've seen the meme lately of if you ever said to yourself, I'm not queer enough, that gives you 12,000 queer points because that's like the queerest thing in the world. So how do you choose your queer content? How do you parse it as queer?
Well, I guess for me as a historian, and then working on this show, I always feel like I'm trapped between two places that I don't want to go, and one of them is, you know, well, sure, they wrote each other many long letters about how much they wanted to like smell each other's breath and hold one another at night, but maybe they were just very good friends. And then on the other side, this other thing, which I think is like equally ahistorical and bad, of saying because what they were doing there and then looks like something that I recognize, it must just be that. And I shouldn't think any more about how that might be different from what is like immediate and understandable to me. There's a really old cliche in history that the past is a foreign country. Things are different there, which I think is a revealing metaphor in two ways. The first, in the way that it means, and in the second, that it establishes a very actually kind of uneasy relationship between time and alterity. And actually a relationship between time and alterity that I think is one of the reasons why queers are so interested in both self-historicization and looking at, and white European queers are so interested in both self-historicization and looking at anthropological and ethnographic data about others to build their own identities. And that's what I'm working on, so that's why I'm thinking about it a lot. But like I think there is a foreignness about the past, and there is something. There's always something kind of intangible there, and I guess what we've tried to do is, with this, as with all of the other things that we do that might be contested, is to just show our work and to just say, you could think this, or you could think this. We think it's useful to apply this lens, therefore, and then we move forward. And then if someone wants to if someone doesn't want to come down the road with us, they don't need to. It's fine. I mean, I don't need to force anybody to think the way that I do. But it's just, for me, it's been more about, I mean, even on the shows where we're dealing with people who are not so easy to fit into these contemporary identity categories, we've just tried to be very clear about what the evidence is, about what we're working on, and about why we think that is justified enough to then see what's interesting about it.
And I see some nodding here from Lee and from Morgan. I know this is, for me, as somebody who is working on making sure that education around queer history is being taught in California, one of our big challenges has been really conveying to educators, hey, right, like, these are folks that may not have used the term, but there's queerness to the story, right? Like, if this person was engaging in what would be considered, quote unquote, cross-dressing of the day, like, whether or not they identified as trans or would identify as trans today is kind of not the story, right? It's that crossing. It's the fact that there is even an idea of crossing in the first place, right? And so, again, I'm just going by the people who were nodding.
I think I really kind of think of myself as, I mean, I'm trained as a historian, but also I feel like my role and the role of like the podcaster is to going off the idea of like history as a foreign country as a translator. One of the things that I really enjoy about this medium is that it gives us the ability to take these stories and these complicated concepts that have historically only been in like academic hands and behind paywalls because they're, on an academic journal somewhere that you have to pay to get. And so I think what's really important is taking all of that historic context and saying, hey, look, we can't just smack one thing onto another and say they're the same, but we can pinpoint to patterns, and we can pinpoint to things that resonate with us, and being able to say to folks that don't have a whole history of, well, this is the way that queerness has existed, not as an identity, but as, patterns of behavior and societal expectations, and say, hey, you do exist in history. You can kind of claim this yourself. And while we may not exactly be able to say, that this person was X or Y, we can go along with the way that it makes us feel. And also sometimes what I think is really interesting is that we look for queerness where maybe queerness didn't actually exist. But we take our own spin on it. Like one example was we had folks ask us to do an episode on Lizzie Borden, who, because there's like this idea of, and it's been popularized in films recently, that like maybe Lizzie Borden was a lesbian and she was having an affair. She was having an affair with Bridget the maid, and that's why the murders happened. And so we looked into it, and we found out that a lot of that was the construction of one novelist that's kind of blossomed into a whole bunch of different theories. But what we did is then went on a separate kind of tangent and talked about the inherent queerness of the idea of spinsterhood, and had a conversation around asexuality, and whether or not we could kind of apply those same societal ideals into something like that. So yeah, I think it's really interesting to be able to say, hey, people who are listening in right now, if you feel that some of this resonates with you, then take it, because God knows people have taken that away from us for so long and literally burned and erased, anywhere we exist in history.
Yeah. I think
Ben, you're muted.
And this is a really old debate in all different kinds of queer history writing. Like these have always been the foundational debates of this kind of writing. How do you make these distinctions? On what criteria? At what time? Do the same kinds of, does the story of the creation of modern sexuality in the late Victorian era that is initially mostly about gay men, does that work for lesbians? Like, what do you do with Boston marriages? What do you do with female romantic friendships? Lillian Faderman says they're lesbians. Layla Rupp says they're not. And this is what, this is what people fight about all the time. So these are not, it's not like these are settled questions outside of public history either. And I think it's really important for all of us who do history that I don't know, I hate saying private history, not public history. I don't know. All of us who do history inside the context of the academy sometimes need to always have that humility with us of realizing that this is a discipline that has always existed on this tension, this sort of track of tension. And it's astonishing until how late the key texts are still not published by academic publishers. Like through the 1990s, a lot of the key texts in queer history are not published by academic publishers. It's fascinating how late all of that goes. And so I would just hope that we could, that by doing more of this work in public, we could all become better at doing it.
Yeah. I think a big part of it is working to peel away what colonization has done to the ideas about queerness, because we're not saying anything new, that queerness has always existed in these different forms. What we're saying is this very narrow idea of queerness that people have in their minds is a direct result of colonization and erasing of traditions and behaviors throughout the entire world, and the cultural expectations and attitudes towards it. Homophobia is a Western invention. So I think that's really important to talk about. And it's a constant thread with almost every single topic that we go into, it's, you know, it's the boogeyman in the night. It's like, colonialism again. Thank you for fucking everything up. So,
yeah.
Morgan,
Please.
One of the things that I'm thinking about in this discussion is like, yes, in many ways, a lot of what you're all saying is true, but part of the work for trans history as well is actually reclaiming trans figures from earlier gay historians.
Yes.
So, which I take a both and approach, I should say, because I don't like to make firm identity claims about anyone from prior to 1950, pretty much.
Right.
But like, for example, I was just working on a story recently about a woman named Eliza Scott, who was an African woman who escaped slavery in the United States and pops up on the streets of London where she's arrested for being a sex worker, and she's sort of hauled before the courts. And that's where we get the pieces of her story, as we do in a lot of queer history. It's usually court records. And what's so fascinating about Eliza Scott, I mean, there are so many levels, like the fact that she was enslaved in America, then was able to escape to the Caribbean, where she worked as an herbal healer for a number of years and may have been involved in more of an African spirituality, which is super fascinating. But then somehow like got on a ship, went to New York, went to London. Anyway, long story short, one of the things that's fascinating to her, for me as a person working with trans history, is that I found her in a book about gay men by a gay historian who wrote about her explicitly as a gay man being tried for same-sex intimacy. And this isn't an old book. This is like in the past 10 years, this book was published. And this is a constant thing that I encounter as I work with trans figures, is that earlier historians, particularly in the mid-20th century, when the discipline of gay history was being founded in the United States and in Europe, gay historians were looking for like anything they could find to sort of bolster a claim to history. And along the way picked up a lot of figures who, in fact, the only evidence we have about their lives is that they were living cross-gender lives. We actually don't know anything about their intimate sexual lives or anything like that. So again, I take a both and approach, but that's been one of the pieces that I've had to really work on over the years of doing this work.
I think that's so interesting, Morgan, because I encounter that a lot as well. We just did an episode on Harry Allen, who was by most accounts a trans man in the Wild West. And I actually had when I was kind of pitching this series to Rick as a moderator, I had talked to him and I was mentioning that, and he hadn't heard this name, but then I said Nell Pickerel, and he was like, "Oh, I've heard of this person." And I think it's really important to highlight the role of historians in contextualizing these people's history, because there was such a fervor for people a lot of like feminist historians to claim, strong female characters from history in the Wild West, that they didn't consider that, yes, this person may have been dressing along gender lines, but it's unethical to claim them in this part of history that you're ascribing them to, especially when we have words from that person themselves. I mean, if you read some of the quotes from Harry Allen and the way that he discusses his attitudes towards, dressing femininely, I don't know that I can find, a better historical explanation of dysphoria, just like as personally as a trans person. Yeah, I wanted to share that little tidbit because I was so surprised. It's like, oh yeah, no, every single article, mentions him by his dead name, and so that's how we hear about him.
Right. I see that, Ben, you have something to say, but before that, I do want to first speak really to the audience right now. We're going to go into a question and answer in like 20 or so minutes. And so I want you to be able to put down questions that you might have for the panel in the different, I guess, chat logs or the discussions on both YouTube and Facebook, so that we can bring them up to the panel when that section starts. Sorry, that was a PSA. Back to Ben.
This is such a very nice.
Sorry, Sally.
Yes. For us, I think in terms of thinking about what we define as queer in history, we're really just looking at anything that's great, any kind of sort of binding against us in this sense. So we talked a little bit about colonization, and with colonization, of course, came the introduction of Christianity and Islam into the continent of Africa, which also just brought very specific gender roles and very specific ways that women were supposed to be, very specific ways that men were supposed to be. And so I think, before you had, women who would inherit their father's throne, and now they became kings, and then their court was full of what I think were then, because they had to be in service of this king, were then dressing like women. It didn't matter if they felt they were women or not. That's how they were presented in this court. So we have all of these moments in history where gender and sexuality is really, really just kind of skewed and made really complicated. And so for us, what we're doing is we're documenting that. And what we can't say for sure, and I think a lot of times people push us on saying for sure, was this person gay? Was this person trans? Was this person? And we're like, we can't say for sure, but what we can do is we can put these questions into the show itself, and we can present to you all the information that we have. We can complicate the way that this narrative has been told over the last couple hundred years. And so that's what we really try to do when we produce our podcast and our show.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to really consider. And so, queerness as a topic, as an identity, it's not been universally understood across the globe. And when one culture tries to describe gender and sexuality of another culture, the potential for misunderstanding is so high, right? Here in the United States, we have over 150 plus different traditions of indigenous peoples that have different gender understandings, up to 5 or more different gender understandings within their traditions. And yet, the narrative in the United States is predominantly a binary one, right, of 2. And as many of you have said earlier, like looking at gender and sexuality through that very specific lens has a tendency to erase and in many cases demonize, right, those understandings. And so I guess my question is, what are the considerations that you make when you are interpreting this history, when you're telling these stories about these things? Because even as I imagine as you research, to Sally's point, right, that those particular ways that it has been interpreted is through that very colonial, patriarchal, European, in many cases, lens. Please, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, I think this actually segues really nicely out of the conversation we were just having, because there's both an ethics of research practice and an ethics of sort of writing and storytelling practice. One of the things that I think is really interesting specifically about this gay-trans divide is that the first, many, not all, many of the first people who are really eager to assert a definitive, uncrossable boundary between gay men and trans women, especially, are gay men. Yep. Because they want to not be associated with trans women who they see as being often of a lower socioeconomic status. Often, like trans women were throughout sort of very inglorious history of 20th century wealthy gay male activism and thinking in the US especially, trans women were always this really inconvenient presence. And so I think it's important, as Morgan said, to take a yes and approach. And I would say that anytime in my work I hit on somebody where there's any ambiguity at all, I think the only ethical thing to do is, again, as I said before, to narrate what you're unsure about, explain why you're making the choice that you're making, and then go ahead and make the choice, obviously being careful about making the choice, you're careful about doing everything. But if at least you've explained how you're doing it, then you've given somebody the ability to come along afterwards and prove you wrong or challenge you or start that conversation with you. And that's how these things happen. We do often find people that we think are important, and we find them in books where we think they've been really misrepresented. And the violence there to me is the just concealing any of the ambiguity, or just, operating from some blind position of thinking that, like, well, just because this person was dressing up in women's clothes, that means that I'm just going to 100% assume that they were gay, because that's the only frame of reference that I have in my mind, and I can't move beyond that at all. In terms of this question about cultural contact, one of the things that's really interesting for me is the ways in which, because queerness is a colonial invention, at least the kinds of homosexualities that are the vocabulary that we're using are created during this kind of late Victorian imperial era. And because queer subjects in the metropolis are often created and governed by the same discourses that are creating the colonies, and these two things are kind of justifying one another. And I'm not saying that queer subjects in the metropolis are the same as structurally as the people who are being colonized, but often the same words and concepts are crossing over and being used to talk about both in dominant discourses. This then often leads to queer people in the metropolis looking to other sex gender systems to try to figure out what's going on with them, which then leads to strange elements of other sex gender systems writing themselves into colonial modernity in unexpected ways. And it's all just endlessly confusing. And like everything involving colonization and capitalism drenched in blood.
Right. And I think you speak to some really important need within just the human experience, and like all of you have said, right, the ability and the desire and the need to see yourself represented in a story of the place that you're in is essential for how we exist in life. And so to be able to pull and say, hey, the story that I've been told doesn't fit me, but this one does. And this one sounds, this one sounds interesting. So I'll take it. It does put us in that really, really in the United States, at least, this really strange position of, all right, well, I'm experiencing this. There are no words that I know, but that culture does, and I'm going to use it now. And that there's also, that danger of not understanding the roots of that word, the social context, the religious context, the spiritual context, the relational context of those things, and then taking them over, right? I think about, the first story that pops into my head is one of the more known ones out of Egypt, which was of Hatshepsut, right? The pharaoh that was assigned female at birth, right? And the way that people in the United States had been talking about, at least what I read, is that it was analogous to having a queen. When I saw more African scholars chiming in, they're like, that's not really how that works, right? The pharaoh is the pharaoh. It's not analogous to a queen. It is the pharaoh, right? And so I'm wondering now, is that that kind of difference of understanding when there's no analog within the culture you're speaking in? How do you go about that conversation?
Okay, I wanna actually talk about this because really it's quite interesting in terms of the work that we do. So the visibility of queer people on the continent in general is closely tied with the LGBT movements in North America and in Europe. So when we first started this work, even the idea of calling, what we now have accepted on the continent as queer people or LGBT, there was years of just fighting about if this is what we were calling ourselves. Where did these words come from, and what did they actually mean? And then there was a push to look at, were there any words for this within our own, language, cultural languages that we could use? So there was many years of arguing that it wasn't really applicable to our existence or our experience with culture. What ended up happening is with activism, and also, just to be completely frank, the funding of LGBT activism on the continent, these phrases like lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender started to be used more widely. And they were used by what we now say maybe the queer community, but also by the religious right in order to really frame and begin this, propaganda sort of culture war that's raging on the continent now and has for the last 7-8 years, very hardcore. So a lot of what has happened in the West and a lot of the language that is used to describe people is basically how we're now describing ourselves. And with that also comes this very narrow idea of what is a gay person, what is a trans person, what is a sexual person. And it's very much rooted in what we are and sometimes consuming. So for the last, in terms of cultural production, research, which is also coming from outside of the continent oftentimes. I think in the last, 5 years, as more cultural production, more, as I say here, academics and researchers are based on the continent, I think there is now even a stronger sense of what an African queer identity is. And again, thinking that there are 54 countries on the African continent. So it does vary by where you are. It does vary by who call it, which country calls you. It does vary by which language you speak. So it's a very complicated sort of what can I say? It's a tapestry of very interesting sort of cultures and clashes that are happening on the continent, and why certain things have been able to happen in Southern Africa that have not been able to happen in West Africa. So there's a lot going on there, and I just want to put that into the conversation.
Yeah. I think we forget that a lot when we talk about this history, that even as we talk about, continental definitions of things, that within those places, there's so many other cultures, right? And I, from the United States perspective, places, especially like Africa or Asia, become this just monolith of, well, that's how it is there. When like literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of countries representing thousands and thousands and thousands of traditions, right, define these different things. So yeah, it is. It's rough. Is there anyone else that has something to say about how you navigate that? I know, Ben, that you did some stuff, but like Morgan, Lee, Huw.
I've been quite conscious in my podcast right from the beginning of this issue, in particular as like a white historian from a traditionally colonized land in Canada. And one of the decisions I made really early on was to only focus my research for the show. I research everything outside the show, but only for the show would focus on North America and Europe, because I didn't want to run the risk of reading my own cultural lens onto a different culture, particularly as you go further back in time. So I've been really quite cautious of that, and how I speak about people who do come from other cultures, even within that area, and really trying to situate people. On the other hand, interestingly, I've seen some pushback of late on this, and I'm kind of following it very curiously. Where, for example, there are now, I've seen a number of Hijra people in Southeast Asia who are like, yes, I am Hijra, but I also consider myself part of the trans community. And yes, trans is the right word to use for me in the English language. And so I'm having to kind of recalibrate how I think and feel about that in terms of what it means for the work that I do specifically. And one of the ways of dealing with that I'm working on is to hopefully in this coming year's season of the show, be bringing in more other historians from other places to speak to those cultural specificities themselves, so that I'm not, still doing that problem of coming in and trying to place my lens on somebody else and their culture, right? So it's something I've been quite conscious of the whole time I've been making the podcast.
Yeah. I think, Ben, you said it really well in that I think the transparency is key. We've been very frank from the beginning that like, hey, with my, my previous co-host, like, we are two people living in the United States who are both white, and we both have different backgrounds, but like we cannot speak to, any one experience that is not ours. But we want to make sure that various elements of queerness are represented, even if those aren't our own personal experiences. And so the way that we approach it is to be really transparent, say, hey, these are our sources, here's where this information is coming from, and also talking about what those sources are. I mean, the sad reality is that the further back you go, the majority of scholarship on queerness comes from a very specifically white or cis lens. And so, talking about various indigenous understandings of gender in the United States, right? Like most of the scholarship is written by white historians calling, various two-spirit identities birdashes. And so really being open and honest about that and discussing our limitations and inviting people to come in and, correct or elaborate in ways that we just don't have the background to do, and also bringing, like Morgan was saying, bringing other voices onto the podcast. But that's been an interesting line that I've personally tried to figure out how to cross is if I don't immediately have someone to tell this from their own perspective, is it unethical to not have that information out in the podcast? Right? Like what you were saying, Morgan, is, if I made a specific decision to only cover X, Y, or Z, then is that going to be viewed as a deliberate erasure, when it's really, I want to make sure that I do this right by who I'm hoping to bring into the conversation. So that's something that I'm always kind of hoping for feedback on, and, because I want to make sure that people feel represented, but also acknowledge that, like, hi, I can't represent you, but I can, I can point people towards where there's more information to be found. I think approaching it as a kind of liaison and translator of, like, here's what I have found and here's what I'm reporting on.
Ben, did you have something?
When we started, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if people can only talk about their own experience. But I do think that when you're not talking about your own experience, you have to be really careful and really think about where you are positioning yourself in these economies of discourse. When we started the show, our first season was entirely about men. And we did that for two reasons. The first was that we thought that in a show about evil people, the obvious, what would be in a show about uncovering fascinating stories or heroes, really obvious. There'd be a really obvious ethics of representation. We didn't see it as much. And we also thought a lot about the optics, and I don't mean by saying optics to write this off, of two men talking about people who aren't men and how evil they are. And what I'm really grateful to our audience for having invested us with the trust to reach out and say, hey, we want you to talk about this too. Like when are you going to start talking about evil lesbians? Like when are you going to start talking about? And so we started by inviting people on, and we're now at a place where our seasons are. Our seasons have evolved to a place where they're much more mixed, whether it's just us or not. And it was also just a matter of building trust with that audience that we had, to the point where they then knew that they knew that we would be trying our best to get everything right and that we would be responsive to pushback, and then we could have that conversation. I don't know, just that felt really good to me, to be given the trust of people to say, like, please take us on as well.
Yeah.
That's a real gift for someone to offer you that.
Absolutely. Oh, I mean, this part of the conversation could go on forever. Let me tell you, when I facilitate groups about identity, this particular part about the naming and what part of the umbrella and what supersedes and how do you talk about things is much larger most of the time than we anticipate. And so thank you for engaging on that. I do want to get to a few of the questions that I've gotten. For some reason, some people texted me them instead of putting them in the chat. But I'm going to ask this one first, which is, for all of you, still leaning into this conversation about language. We've had a lot of transition about how we talk about things, what words we use. And there is still a very strong desire for a lot of us to be able to use the larger umbrella of queer. But queer, first of all, is as a term that is negative in its roots, and two, one that does not necessarily describe a lot of different parts of our communities. And so in your search, either through the cultural stuff, historical stuff, is there a word that can encompass the diversity of what we would consider queerness besides queer? Right, LGBTQ gets crazy because that's like LGBTQ, LPI, it was like LMNOP, right? Like
same-sex loving and gender non-conforming people is what I use when I have to be like real precise.
Yeah.
But I hate it so much.
Right?
Yeah. I've gotten really enamored of the term gender expansive. Like the idea that like we're expanding out from the binary. I'm not a huge fan of like gender variant because that just seems like there's something, that you're varying from that's the normal. We actually did our first episode, our like episode 0 was introducing the show and specifically talking about the language that we were going to be using, because there's gaps everywhere. I mean, the show is called History is Gay because it's succinct and easy, but we don't just talk about gay, and we use gay as like a catch-all, right, for everything. And there are some people who have, had problems with that. There are some people who have had problems with us using the word queer. We decided that we would be very, 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 again, transparent about it. And, specifically talked about how, there are words that belong to people that are not us. And should we use them, if we're not talking about that specific community? Should we use things like women loving women if we're not talking about specifically, like Black lesbian experience? Yeah, I think no matter what you do, there will always be something left out. And I mean, that's one of the things that I actually really enjoy about the word queer from a personal standpoint is, you know, there's been a resurgence of people talking about like queer as a slur. And I'm just sitting here like, every single word that has ever been used to describe us that we currently use has come from being a slur. So why do we go so far on this one word?
Right.
And I mean, you know, not to get on a soapbox, but a lot of that is like a lot of turf recruitment happening on the internet.
Yeah.
Away from that.
Sully, I saw that you had something to say.
Oh, you're
muted, Sully.
There we go.
When we were naming the podcast, the first name we came up with was Afroqueer, and we were all like, "Oh no, we can't call it Afroqueer because I don't even know what we." I think we just thought like, "Oh, that doesn't really like capture the breadth of, you know, all the diversity." So then we spent about 2 months trying to come up with a name that we thought could capture the diversity of 54 countries with diversity of sexuality, gender. And then we came back to like Afroqueer. So yes. And by the time we got back to Afroqueer, we thought it was so genius. But I think it also was because we were really exhausted by this point. I couldn't think of anything that could capture all of this, right? And so I think that just goes back to the limitations of language, right? And so we had to fall into something that we thought, and it wasn't just about sexuality and gender difference. It was also about culture. It was about language. It was about geography. Like we just were like, how do we fit all of this into one phrase? And it was an impossible undertaking. But luckily, we haven't gotten any hate yet about it. We haven't gotten people being like, you know, I mean, we get more approached about like, why haven't you done the story in Northern Africa yet? You know, like that's what happens to us a lot of the time. Like, why haven't you covered, you know, my tribe and such? And we're like, oh my God, we're only 5 people. You know, we have, you know. So, but
imagine being 5 people.
Yeah, I'm like, it's just 5 of us, but we don't get pushed back so much about the queer aspect of it just yet. But I think also language is changing so fast. You know, we have our comms person, Rachel. She's the one who's so keyed in, so she'll come in and be like, you know, this is what we need to be saying now, and we're all like, oh, we didn't, you know, we're just like catching up all the time on different ways that people are, you know, talking about gender and sexuality. And I actually feel like for the first time, I'm like behind the curve. Like she'll come into the office and tell me something I've never heard before, and I need her to like break it down for me, you know. So we're also just like trying to make sure that we are inclusive and also understand the limitations of the language that we're using sometimes. Yeah.
Just really quick, if you're interested in the language part of this specifically, just a shout out to a really wonderful friend, Helen Zaltzman, does a podcast called The Illusionist, and it's all about language. And there have been several episodes on the language of queerness around the world and the ways in which certain terms have been erased due to colonization as well, or ways to try to find language for gender and sexual identity experiences that aren't analogous to what we have in, you know, English and this kind of modern way of speaking about these experiences. Just a real quick shout out. If you person who asked this question are really interested in looking more into the language element of it, I highly recommend The Illusionist. Might as well plug more podcasts. Listen to them.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Lee. I do want to recognize that we are rounding the corner here for the time, and I know it's late for most of you on this call. So I do want to get to, I think the last question, which was in the comments, is going to be a great one to end with, which is, for each of you, do you have a favorite episode from your collection? Like if you're going to send somebody to your site and go, this is the one you got to listen to get into it, what would you say?
Can I go?
Yes, please.
Sorry, I've got a question here. I've got bad internet at the moment. For me, it would be the episode we did on Morrissey. Only because that's like a personal favorite of mine, because it was something that touched me like quite personally in terms of like my own growing up myself as like a gay man in the same sort of environment in the north of England, and how much he meant to me, and to then go back and look at his life and especially to like to find where he went wrong, if that makes sense, even though it's quite recent history. Like, it tells you so much about like the last 20 years of 40 years of British history, and queer history, and like the way he identifies and has navigated that. And for me, like, I found that fascinating because it really made me interrogate myself, like why I ignored so many things that were so clear, like that he didn't go wrong in some ways. He was always on that path. So for me, like that, I found that the most interesting of like as a way of like examining recent history through someone who's like undoubtedly like a terrible gay, to then go back and say like why do we choose to see these things and ignore each other things, and it was kind of like the process that we normally apply to these historical figures. I kind of had to partly apply to my own thinking about things and my own perspectives. So yeah, although it's not necessarily representative of the entire show, for me, like the Morrissey episode was for me the most interesting and challenging to write.
Great.
Let's say usually our show is pretty spoken. I mean, we have outlines and it's not bantery at all. That's one of our rules. We don't do banter. But they're usually not like exquisitely crafted pieces of writing. And the Morrissey episode opens with just, I mean, the extended essay that Huw wrote, it is just such a piece of writing, and he was a really good writer, and you should all go listen to it.
Aww.
The other episode I'll plug, if you can possibly stand, those of you who are listening from the US, to think about US electoral politics anymore at the moment. We did a show at the beginning of this year, just before the Iowa caucuses, about Mayor Pete. And I think there's a lot of really good thinking in that show about the limitations and failures of liberal gay politics in the United States. And those lessons seem to be being reflected back to us in a lot of things that are going on. And so I would really urge people going to listen to that. It was also very moving for me because one of our two guests on that, the brilliant and inimitable Mac Folks, very unexpectedly passed away about a month after recording. And so I'm really moved to have that sort of document of his thinking and speaking. And so I would suggest that people go listen to that, and that's see the one that got all the gay men in the US really mad at us.
Thank you, Ben. All right. Should I just call on you as I?
Yeah, I think we're all thinking.
Okay. Well, I'm just gonna go this way then, and so Morgan, what show?
Okay. If I have to choose just one, but actually I'm going to give you two. But if I had to choose just one, I would choose the episode called Valentine's Day Special, which is about this trans guy named Lawrence Michael Dillon, who's arguably the first trans person to use hormones in the world, the first trans guy to receive phalloplasty, like the first modern transsexual man, you could say, who is a fascinating character, but especially fascinating for me as a trans woman who only dates trans men, because he got into a relationship with a trans woman named Roberta Cowell, and turned out she was just using him to get access to doctors and surgery, and like not only broke his heart, but sold his story to the papers so that he had to flee Britain and move to India and become a Tibetan monk just to get away from the newspapers that were hounding him. And then anyway, he dies as a monk. So it's a whole thing. He also happens to be one of the first like 5 Westerners to become Tibetan Buddhists. And so it's a wild, wild story. And like the woman, Roberta Cowell, she was a Spitfire pilot in World War II, just to add to it. Like there's so many details. And then she became a race car driver and was like the first trans race car driver. Anyway, it was the whole thing. So that one is really funny and a personal favorite. And I will also say one that I am fascinated with for its historical importance or the history that it touches on is called Cross-Dressing. Hold on, let me see what it is. It's called Cross-Dressing Racist Laws and Murders. And it's about a trans man in the 19th century in San Francisco who gets repeatedly arrested under cross-dressing laws, which were brought in to police the Chinese community in San Francisco. So you have this white trans man getting arrested under laws meant to police the Chinese community, who keeps being found, like he keeps getting picked up by police in the beds of various prostitutes that he was dating and trying to like break up with their boyfriend / manager pimp type people. So you have many elements here that I really love, which is like trans men who only date sex workers. And you also have like this wild context of super racist, weird laws that like tells the actual origin of the anti-cross-dressing laws in America, which is entirely about policing the Asian community. And then you also have like what happens to him eventually, and I won't spoil it. But
is this the same person that like tried to like gathered up all of these women who were sex workers and was like, "Hey, do you want to be in my cool sex worker gang?"
No, who's that?
That is we just did a mini episode where we included him. I'm gonna have to look it up. I can't remember his name.
Okay, you tell me later. But yeah, anyway, that's it for me.
Amazing. Oh, wow. All right. Well, Sally, you're up. I know you just said that it's impossible to pick one, but
it's impossible because I executive produce the show, but like I have a team that works on every episode, and some people do some episodes, and so I always feel like if I choose one, I'm sort of like, and it's so I just want to say if any of them are listening that I'm choosing one only because I've been asked to. So I think that the one that I would suggest people go listen to is an episode called Dakan, which in Mandinka means destiny. So many years ago, when I was a bit younger, I came across this YouTube video or this YouTube excerpt of a film that was made all in French in West Africa that had it was a gay love story, and it was made in 1997. And I remember being like 25 and seeing this and being like, this is not possible. Like, how was this film made? And, you know, how come no one knows about this film? And where is this film? And I remember having like, who's the filmmaker? And I was trying to Google and couldn't find anything about him. So years later, fast forward about 10 years later, one of our audience members actually pitched us and said, hey, I want to find the guy who made this film, Dakan. And I was like, wow, me too. So the whole team got together and we spent months trying to track down Mohamed Kamara. We thought he was in Paris. We thought he got exiled, all these things. And then finally we found him, and he is a straight man living in West Africa who had made this film because he was just very interested and wanted to know more about queer life. But he was eventually like kicked out of the West African film community, and all these things happened. So we follow his story of like trying to tell this story, and then kind of how it sort of destroyed his career and all the things that happened after. So I would listen to that episode because it's one of my personal favorites because it means a lot to me from when I was growing up. But we have a lot of great episodes, so please listen to them all.
Thank you for rising to the challenge. That sounds amazing.
That was really good.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
I don't know.
But
I
Morgan,
think
say I am gonna listen to everything you just. I heard like every other word, and I was like, "Oh my god, this sounds so good!" And like a movie, and I need to now listen to this as soon as we get off of here. So I am very excited. Thank you for making that.
oh,
Yes.
this is why this question was asked, right? We wanna know. And so, last but definitely not least, our host for today.
Oh gosh. I mean, I think one of the people that I was most delighted to learn about that I had no idea about at all is we did 2 episodes on some prominent Jewish folks in queer history. Two-part episodes called Nazi Punks Fuck Off. And we covered Magnus Hirschfeld, but the second episode we covered Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, who were 2 I'll say genderqueer artists in France from the 1920s to 1940s who were wild, just like the most surreal, weird art, constantly crossing gender boundaries, and they were anti-Nazi fighters, like would go around and write anti-Nazi propaganda on the backs of like Nazi propaganda and stuff them in cigarette cartons that German soldiers would find, and they were writing them from the perspective of this character that was a disgruntled German soldier, and they were trying to get Nazis to defect. And I just sit here and I go, "Where's my movie? Where's the movie about these people?"
Right.
And it's really interesting because a lot of scholarship is really, called them lesbian heroes, but when you look at a lot of Claude Cahun's own writing, I like to use they them pronouns. They specifically talk about what would they would love to they would love to use a gender neutral pronoun like neuter in German. There's also like a really fantastic picture of Claude Cahun after getting out of a Nazi prison camp of an SS eagle in their mouth turned upside down, literally just flipping the bird. I think that was one of my favorite episodes, just to like learn about this person. And I really, really enjoy one of our early episodes talking about a lot of gay and lesbian, bisexual and lesbian blues divas in the Harlem Renaissance. As as a white person, like I was never ever exposed to how queer the Harlem Renaissance was, and it was a delight for me to step into a world that I wasn't a part of and learn about these incredible women and listen to the lyrics of Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith and Lucille Bogan and be like, oh my God, wow, this is real gay. So yeah, I think those are 2 of my favorites. I really enjoy.
I love it. It sounds like you all have given some incredible shows for the folks that are watching, and for me, to be perfectly honest. Listen to.
And are we the only people who are in the middle of a season right now? Or are there other people who are also like in the middle of releasing? I'm looking around. So we, just to situate it, we are releasing a new episode every Tuesday and have been for 3 weeks so far, and will do so for another like 4 or 5 weeks. and then, or no, another like 7 weeks, and then we'll go away for a few months, and then we'll make another season, and then we'll bring it out again. So, like, if people want to check us out, we're in the middle of a season.
We've
right
actually
now,
got an upcoming show on the Harlem Renaissance.
Exciting.
Very good.
And actually an upcoming show on some queers in France in World War II who were also artists and, spoiler alert, did not fight for the resistance.
Because they were bad games.
I'll drop a name. If you ever wondered how Gertrude Stein and Alice Toklas managed to be Jewish lesbian art collectors in France in World War II and live and eat food, the answer you will discover on our show. And also race car drivers are going to come up, including someone who actually cut off her breasts to drive a race car and dated Josephine Baker, but then also maybe tortured people for the Gestapo.
All right. Well,
so, you know.
Yeah, we do. We try to. I say we. Right now, I don't have a co-host at the moment, so I've been doing a lot of guest hosts. We try to do like an episode a month right now, but I've been considering moving to seasons so that I can sleep at some point.
Yeah. Yeah. Are the Morgan and Sally, are you in the middle of a season right now?
We have one more episode that's going to come out in 2 weeks, and then we're done for the year. I'm very happy about that. We're also producing 2 other shows, so we're still working, actually, up until the end of December. But we'll launch Afroqueer season 4 in March.
Yes.
Sounds like you're saying that right now for the first time to keep yourself accountable for it.
Exactly. I'm like, end of March.
Like, all right, I said it live on live stream.
Yes. It's part of the public record now. So.
There it is. Morgan, are you in the middle of a season, or?
I don't really have seasons. I am very capricious with when I release episodes. In theory, it's once a month, but it's really like once a month when I have enough executive function left to get myself to actually do it. So there will be new episodes eventually. You'll see them. I don't know when.
We don't decide to do hard podcasts where we have to like do homework.
Because it's what we
honestly,
need.
if we would just do one of these shows where it's just people like drinking and talking over each other, it would be so much.
Yeah.
And
I think there's a show to be
but
pitched.
those were our rules. I mean, we set clear ground rules when we started. The rules were no wine, no reading Wikipedia articles out loud with no additional context, no banter, and no talking over each other. And we've held fast to those guidelines.
Yeah. Well, I think we have a good seed for a new show. But I do want to recognize that we are 43 past the hour, and I want to thank all of you for being such an amazing panel, and thank you for sharing all your expertise, all your, in my definition, geekery around such really, really important subjects. I'm not going to have the last word. I'm going to hand it back over to our host, Lee. And here we go.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much to all of our wonderful panelists. I'm going to go spend the rest of my day listening to everyone's shows while I do my work. Please feel free to check out everyone's websites. We will put them up on our site with the video, and please consider becoming a member of the GLBT Historical Society and following us on all of our socials. You can find us online at glbthistory.org, and I hope everyone has a good and safe weekend, and take care of yourselves out there in this very stressful week. Have a wonderful time. And